In 1910, if you lost your job and couldn't pay rent, there was almost nothing standing between you and the street. No welfare, no shelter, no government program. You were out. By 2005, there was food stamps, Medicaid, a caseworker, and a cell phone, but most people still couldn't get out. That gap between what existed and what worked is the whole story. This is a decade by decade tour of what homelessness looked like, felt like, and survived like in America from 1900 to 2026. Let's start at the Bowery in New York City around 1905. The sun isn't up yet, and men are already shuffling into line. They're wearing patched wool coats and newsprint stuffed inside their shoes for insulation. The smell is coal smoke, horse manure, and the faint chemical bite of carbolic soap, the stuff Flophouse keepers poured over everything to keep the lice down. For 5 cents a night, you got a cot in a room with 100 other men. The sheets were changed once a month. TB moved through those rooms like wind through a screen door, killing about 5,000 people a year in New York City alone, according to health department logs from that era. These were mostly single men, Civil War veterans, newly arrived immigrants, and workers squeezed out of farms by machinery and out of factories by the boom and bust cycle of the 1895 to 1907 period. When the panic of 1907 hit and threw 500,000 people out of work, the Bowery Flophouses were packed shoulder to shoulder. Black men who came north during the early waves of the Great Migration found something worse than a flophouse. They found the door closed entirely. White missions, white shelters, white soup kitchens. There were separate facilities for black men, fewer of them, worse conditions, and shorter hours. If you showed up at the wrong door, you were turned away to sleep under an elevated train platform. Getting out of homelessness in this era required one thing above everything else: a steady employer willing to vouch for you. Not just hire you, but write a letter and tell a landlord you were worth a deposit. There was no welfare, no housing program, and no government pathway. The federal government did not consider this its problem. Cities had vagrancy laws, meaning police could arrest you simply for having no visible means of support. That meant arrest for being poor and having nowhere to go. The city used those laws not to help people, but to move them along, to keep them invisible, to cycle them through a night in jail and back onto the street by morning. The journalist Jacob Riis had photographed these flophouses in 1890 and published them in his book, How the Other Half Lives. People were shocked, then mostly nothing changed. The 1920s are remembered as the Roaring Twenties, jazz clubs, flappers, and the stock market climbing. Out in the rail yards, something else was happening. Between 200,000 and 500,000 Americans were living as what Nels Anderson, a sociologist who actually rode the rails and lived among them, called the new hobos. These weren't the romanticized wanderers of folk songs. They were farm workers whose land had been foreclosed after the First World War deflation hit commodity prices. They were factory hands whose jobs had been eaten by machines faster than new ones appeared. They moved by freight car, jumping on in the dark, clinging to the undercarriage through wind and cold, riding to wherever word had traveled that harvest work was available. In the clearings beside rail yards, they built hobo jungles, collections of lean-tos and open fires where mulligan stew simmered in a communal tin pot. It was made from whatever anyone had: potato skins, scraps of salt pork, and foraged greens. Anderson documented an entire coded language carved into fence posts and chalked on sidewalks. The symbols meant safe house here, hostile farmer stay away, or this town will feed you, but keep moving. It was a functioning underground survival system with its own ethics, rules, and community. The railroads did not tolerate it. They employed Pinkerton detectives called bulls, whose job was to find men riding freight and beat them off, not arrest them. Beat them. In southern states, vagrancy laws still allowed whipping as a penalty. Prosperity era America looked at this population and largely decided the economy was fine, so these people must have chosen it. The barriers to getting out were real. The same mechanization that had displaced them was continuing to displace others. Wages were being pushed down, and there was still no federal program, no safety net, and no pathway except finding a boss willing to take a seasonal chance on you. By 1932, the bottom had fallen out of the economy, and homelessness stopped being invisible. Los Angeles had a city of tin shacks built from Ford motor crates and tar paper on empty lots near the river. St. Louis had one. Seattle had one called Hooverville, named to shame President Herbert Hoover, who insisted recovery was around the corner. These shanty towns had populations in the thousands. They had streets with names. They elected internal councils to settle disputes. Children washed tin dishes in mud puddles. Families slept 4 to a cot made from a packing crate. For the first time in American history, homelessness had stopped being mostly a story about single men. Women and children entered the statistics in mass numbers. Between 1 and 3 million people were unhoused at the peak, though the real count was likely higher because women were often hidden in the family numbers. Their homelessness recorded as a family's homelessness and therefore less visible. Black families and families who had fled the Dust Bowl, the so-called Okies, were hit hardest and received the least. When Franklin Roosevelt's administration launched the Federal Transient Program in 1933, it housed and fed hundreds of thousands of people in makeshift camps, but it was racially segregated. White families were served first and better. Black families waited longer, received less, and were turned away from facilities that were technically open to them. The program was canceled in 1935 when it ran out of political support, and the camps were often demolished by police whether residents wanted to leave or not. There is a letter in the historical record from a Hooverville resident to Roosevelt. We built something here. We governed ourselves. Then they came and burned it down. The WPA work programs that came later were a genuine ladder for some people. A man who got onto a WPA crew could earn a consistent wage and find his way back to a room. But those jobs were rationed, they were segregated, and they ended before the economy had fully recovered. The Second World War changed things fast. By 1942, factories were running around the clock, unemployment had collapsed, and transient camps organized by the federal government were converting men who had been living under bridges into factory workers. For a brief window, the war economy did what no social program had managed. It employed almost everyone. The streets cleared. Then the war ended and a new crisis began quietly. In 1956, Congress funded the interstate highway system. Federal urban renewal programs accelerated. Cities, flush with federal money and developer ambition, decided that cheap rooming houses, the single-room occupancies, or SROs that had housed low-income single adults for generations were slums that needed to go. In New York City alone, urban renewal demolished 60,000 SRO beds. The Bowery, which had housed tens of thousands of low-income men for 50 years, was systematically torn down. In Cincinnati, 63,000 black families were displaced by urban renewal projects with minimal compensation and no replacement housing. One image captures this moment precisely. A wrecking ball swings into an SRO building and suitcases, shoes, and the small belongings of people who had been given days or weeks to leave spill from the windows and doors. Those people had nowhere to go that they could afford. The SRO had been the lowest rung on the housing ladder, the last stop before the street. Urban renewal didn't just demolish buildings. It removed an entire tier of affordable housing from American cities and never replaced it. Welfare programs had technically begun. Aid to families with dependent children provided some help, but it came with morality conditions, residency requirements, and caseworkers who could terminate your benefits for having a man's shoes near the door. For single men, there was almost nothing. In 1972, a young reporter named Geraldo Rivera snuck a camera into Willowbrook State School on Staten Island. What he found was not a school, it was a warehouse. Residents with severe disabilities lay on bare floors in their own waste. Some were in cages, some were without clothing. It was the most extreme face of a national system that had, for decades, housed hundreds of thousands of mentally ill Americans in state institutions far from public view. The expose accelerated a movement already underway. Deinstitutionalization, the policy of closing state psychiatric hospitals, and releasing patients into community care. The logic was humane. Institutions had been brutal. Patients had rights. But there was a second half of the plan, the community mental health centers that were supposed to receive them, treat them, and house them, and that half was never funded. Between 1955 and 1980, the population of state psychiatric hospitals fell from 550,000 to 138,000. Most of those people were released with little more than a bus ticket. The SROs that might have housed them had already been demolished. The shelters that might have caught them did not yet exist at scale. They appeared on streets in cities across the country, untreated, unsupported, and with nowhere to go. The first municipal emergency shelters were opened in New York City in the mid-70s. They were often terrifying, large armory buildings converted into dormitory floors lit by humming fluorescent lights, with intake processes that involved surrendering your belongings and your dignity in exchange for a cot. Violence was common. Staff were undertrained. People who had any other option avoided them. Meanwhile, Vietnam veterans were returning home in large numbers, many with what we now call PTSD and what was then called nothing. The VA was ill-equipped for them. Vagrancy laws were still on the books. The structural foundation for mass modern homelessness had now been fully assembled. No cheap housing, no institutional care, no community care, a shelter system that felt like punishment, and no federal law acknowledging any responsibility. 1983, New York City, midnight. A woman is standing in line outside a shelter on the Lower East Side. She has 2 children with her. One is asleep against her shoulder. The other is holding a stuffed rabbit. She has been in this line for 2 hours. The shelter may not have space. She is one of a surging new demographic in American homelessness, mothers with children. Between 1978 and 1988, the number of homeless Americans expanded dramatically from an estimated 100,000 to figures in the millions. Though the exact count was contested because no one was systematically counting. What was not contested was what drove it. Between 1981 and 1988, the Reagan administration cut federal investment in public housing by roughly 80%. That translated to approximately 300,000 housing units that were never built or maintained. At the same time, the crack cocaine crisis was intersecting with poverty in ways that compounded housing instability. Women, people of color, and young adults in their 20s appeared in shelter populations in numbers that had never been seen before. By the mid-80s, women made up more than 30% of shelter residents in major cities. Shelters responded with a model called the staircase. The idea was simple. You had to earn permanent housing by demonstrating progress. First, you got emergency shelter, but only if you were sober. Then transitional housing if you complied with treatment. Then permanent housing if you had maintained both. At every step, you could be removed for non-compliance. The chain was theoretically logical and practically impossible for people dealing with untreated mental illness or addiction, because you were being asked to achieve stability as a precondition for receiving the stability that would make achievement possible. In 1987, Congress passed the McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act, the first federal law in American history to acknowledge that homelessness existed and that the government had some responsibility to address it. It created funding streams for shelters and services. It was a genuine milestone, but it did not build housing. Without housing, the shelter system simply absorbed people rather than transitioning them out. By the 1990s, homelessness had been a visible mass crisis for a decade, and cities were running out of patience. The 1994 crime bill funded an approach called broken windows policing, the idea that cracking down on minor disorder, including loitering and sleeping on sidewalks, would prevent larger crime. In cities across the country, police sweeps jailed an estimated 20,000 homeless people per year for what amounted to being poor in public. A man holding a cardboard sign on a highway median, a woman sleeping on a bench, a camp of tents behind a supermarket. These were now treated as criminal matters rather than housing matters. At the same time, the 1996 welfare reform law, signed by President Clinton, tightened eligibility requirements significantly, cutting off benefits for people who could not document work activity or who had prior drug convictions. Welfare had never been a solution to homelessness, but it had been a partial buffer. That buffer shrank. Then something genuinely new arrived, the housing first model. Sam Tsimbaris, a researcher in New York City, ran a series of studies that tested a radical-seeming idea. What if you just gave homeless people housing with no sobriety requirement, no compliance condition, and no staircase to climb, and provided support services after they were housed rather than before? The results were striking. Retention rates reached 80%. People with chronic mental illness who had cycled through shelters for years stayed housed. The model worked. It spread slowly, underfunded, and at a fraction of the scale needed. Then came the 2008 financial crash. 10 million families lost their homes to foreclosure. The banks that had issued the subprime mortgages received federal bailout funds. Families who had lost their homes received sweep notices when they camped in parks. Tent cities appeared outside Sacramento, outside Seattle, outside Nashville. Organized communities with generators shared cooking and, in some cases, satellite television. The tools available to a homeless person in 2005 were meaningfully better than in 1985. Food stamps called SNAP were widely used. Cell phones had changed survival logistics entirely. You could call a shelter to check availability before walking 3 miles. You could find where a meal was being served. You could reach a family member. But the gap between having these tools and actually escaping homelessness remained enormous. Housing first worked where units existed. Units rarely existed. Waiting lists in most major cities ran 3 to 7 years. In 2023, the federal government's annual count placed the number of homeless Americans at 653,000. Housing researchers who study the methodology of that count, which is conducted on a single January night and misses people sleeping in cars, camping in forests, or doubled up in someone's living room, estimate the real number is closer to 1 million or above. 40% of homeless Americans are black in a country where black Americans make up 13% of the population. That disparity is not an accident. It is the accumulated result of a century of policies redlining, urban renewal, segregated shelter systems, and racially unequal enforcement. In Los Angeles, a drone flying low over the LA River in 2023 would pass over hundreds of tents stretching along both banks for miles. Inside those tents, people with smartphones, people with chronic illness, people who had been swept from their previous location and had relocated here, and people who had been housed 6 months ago and lost it when fentanyl took hold. The fentanyl and methamphetamine crisis of the 2010s and 2020s created a new dimension of complexity. Addiction had always intersected with homelessness, but synthetic opioids operated at a different order of lethal speed. People were dying in encampments from overdoses at a rate that strained any analogy to earlier eras. Cities responded with anti-camping ordinances in California, Oregon, and Texas, laws that made it a criminal offense to sleep outside when no indoor shelter was available. Encampment sweeps were conducted with increasing frequency, destroying tents, scattering belongings, and forcing people to relocate. That broke the continuity of any services they were connected to. The Supreme Court's ruling in 2024 in the case of City of Grants Pass versus Johnson held that cities could enforce these laws even when shelter space was unavailable, effectively recriminalizing homelessness in a way not seen since the vagrancy statutes of 1910. Housing first continued to expand. Where it was funded and where units existed, it continued to work. The problem was that housing units were the bottleneck. Zoning laws in most American cities made it illegal to build the density of affordable housing needed to absorb the population. Land costs had risen to the point where affordable units required massive public subsidy to be financially viable. The barriers in 2026 were not moral failures or personal deficiencies. They were math. Housing costs more than low-wage work pays. That has been true in every decade covered here, from the 1910s with their flophouses to today with their encampment sweeps. The Urban Institute projected in 2024 that artificial intelligence-driven job displacement could add another 10 to 15% to economic housing instability by 2028 as clerical and service roles are automated away. If that sounds familiar, it should. It is the same pattern that produced the new hobos of the 1920s, when farm machinery eliminated agricultural jobs faster than urban industry could absorb the workers. The tools have changed. The math has not. In 1910, a man who lost his job had almost nothing. No shelter, no food program, no government acknowledgement that his situation existed. He had a flophouse if he had 5 cents, church soup if he sat through a sermon, and the street if he had neither. Over the next 115 years, the tools got better. Bread lines became welfare. Welfare became food stamps. Charity hospitals became Medicaid. Word of mouth became smartphones. Soup kitchens became app-sourced meal pickups. A country that once had no federal law acknowledging homelessness passed McKinney-Vento in 1987 and built a patchwork of shelters, case managers, and housing first units that did not exist in any prior era. And yet, in 2026, 653,000 people are outside tonight by the official count. The tools expanded. The math did not change. When housing costs more than people earn, somebody ends up on the street. That has been true in every decade covered here, from the 1910s with their flophouses to the 1930s with their Hoovervilles to the 1980s with their midnight shelter lines, and today with their encampment sweeps. The safety net got larger and more sophisticated across a century of effort. The gap it was built to cover got larger faster. That is the full arc. Not a story of failure or of progress, but of both, running in parallel, decade by decade, all the way to now.